So today I'm going to be changing the oil on my Mini Cooper Clubman 2008 model. I'm making this video because I've looked online and there's hardly any guides that show how to change the oil on this car, particularly the non-turbo version. I'm also going to be replacing 2 vanoss solenoids. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I've had this problem with this car with an intermittent check engine light that comes on and off. And so I've bought a Wi-Fi adapter and it lets you read the error codes on the engine. So the error codes show that there's a problem with the variable valve timing on this engine, and it uses a system called vanoss, which is common to Minis, BMWs and also Peugeots and a few other cars that share similar engines. And it could be a number of things. It could be the timing chain, could be stretched, or they also have guides on the timing chain which might have broken, or it could be the vanoss solenoids, which I'm hoping is what the case is. So basically most of the time it works fine. When the check engine light comes on, there's a bit of a reduction in power, but apart from that the engine still runs practically fine. So I think that it probably most likely is the actuators rather than the timing chain itself. To see if it is the timing chain, I'd have to take the valve cover off the engine, and at the moment I don't want to do that because I don't have a replacement gasket for it, and the gasket already leaks, so I think if I take that off, it will probably just crumble apart and then I wouldn't be able to put the valve cover back on. So with the error codes that I'm getting, it's hard to tell whether it is a problem with 1 or 2 solenoids. There are 2 solenoids in the motor. One is the exhaust solenoid and one is the intake solenoid. This is what they look like. And so I just ordered 2 brand new ones. eBay is amazing for this stuff. These cost $85, I think, for 2 brand new solenoids. So while I change the oil today, I'm just going to replace both of these solenoids as well, and fingers crossed it fixes my check engine light issue. So here's the first vanoss solenoid that I'm going to be changing, and it's at the front of the engine, and the other vanoss solenoid is located down there underneath the air filter. So that one's going to be a little bit trickier because I'm going to have to remove the air filter housing first before I can access that one. But I'm going to do them at the same time as changing the oil. So I'm going to first drain the oil from the engine. I'm also going to change the oil filter, which in the non-turbo version is located down here and has easy access. Drain the oil, and then while the oil is drained, I'll replace both of these solenoids, refill the car, and hopefully that fixes my problem. So my first tip is never ever crawl underneath a car unless it's securely supported by jack stands. Now, over there, I've got one jack stand supporting the car at the jacking point, but I've got another one just behind it because even jack stands can fail. And if that first jack stand that is currently supporting the car's weight breaks, the car will fall onto the second jack stand instead of onto me. Never ever trust a hydraulic jack like this one. Always use a jack stand when you're working underneath your car. So here's the drain plug that we need to access to drain the oil from the sump. As you can see, I've only got the front left of the car jacked up because the low part of the sump is on the bottom right, so that's fine. It allows the oil to drain out of the lowest point of the sump. So I've got everything I need ready to go for the oil change. I've got a drain pan to collect the old oil. I've got Castrol Edge fully synthetic 5W30 oil, a new oil filter ready to go. I also have my 2 vanoss solenoid flush, and I've also got the 2 unusual sockets that you'll need for changing the oil. One is the T50 Torx socket, which as you can see has a starred end, and also a 27mm socket for the oil filter housing. So I've had to buy both of these specifically for changing the oil on this car. Now, one tip before you start with your oil change, what you want to use is a good engine flush, like this one here, liquid moly engine flush. You put this in the engine, start it up and let it run for 10 or 15 minutes before you drain the oil. And this will help remove any sludge buildup that might be in the engine. But before you put this in the engine and let it run for 10 or 15 minutes, what you should do is just break the seal on the sump plug drain with your T50 Torx socket. Not on this car, but on a previous car, I had put this engine flush in the motor and run it for 15 minutes and then gone to undo the sump plug, and it was stuck solid. So I had an engine with engine flush in it that I couldn't get out, which is not a good thing. So I had to drive to a mechanic's. They basically had to cut the plug off and give me a new one, and it wasn't a good experience. So before you put this in your engine, definitely just undo the drain plug a little bit, just to make sure that you can actually undo it after you've done your engine flush. So to do my engine flush, I'm using this liquid moly engine flush, simply because I like the look of the branding and it's made in Germany, and this car's made in Germany, so it makes sense to me. So this is a 300ml tin, and it recommends 300ml for up to 5 litres of engine oil, so it's more than sufficient for this little engine. So I'm just going to pour this into the motor. Pop the cap back on, start the car and let it run for 15 to 20 minutes for that engine flush to do its work. So what I'm going to do while I'm waiting for the engine flush to work its magic in the engine is clear that check engine light, which with this app, OBD Car Doctor, is really easy. So it'll come up with your error codes straight away when you open the app. You can click on show details, which shows you all the error codes there. Now I just want to save this before I clear it so I can look at them later on. So I've saved my engine code information there. So now to get rid of that check engine light, all I have to do is hit clear. And it says, do you really want to clear diagnostic trouble codes from your ECU? Okay. And there you go, check engine light is gone. Now we'll see what happens. Hopefully it doesn't come back on while I'm running the engine flush, because I want to test these new vanoss components that I'm putting in the engine and see if they actually fix this problem or not. So the engine's been running now for around 15 minutes with the engine flush in it, so it is time to drain the oil. I've got my oil drain pan here, which I'll put underneath the drain plug. I will grab my T50 Torx socket. Now because I cracked it before, it's already been leaking a little bit, which is good because that means the oil's nice and liquid, flowing nicely. There goes my light. Let's put that back. So you want to be careful, because the whole idea of running the engine for 15 minutes is to heat up the oil so it flows freely. So it's going to be pretty hot. So I'll just get a rag. And now I've cracked it, I can undo it with my fingers. It's not too hot. There we go. So I'm just going to let that drain. Well, for quite a while, because I'm going to be replacing the vanoss solenoids. And look at that. That car definitely needed an oil change. So while the oil is draining, I'm just going to change the oil filter, which is much easier on the non-turbo version as opposed to the turbo version, because the oil filter housing is actually underneath this coolant reservoir. So on the turbo, you've got to take this out to actually undo the oil filter housing. So much easier on the non-turbo. I've got my 27mm socket on the breaker bar again. This shouldn't be done up too tightly because it's just a plastic housing, so it should be pretty easy to loosen. There's the oil filter. Inside the filter housing. So this here, if I can get it out, is the part that I'm replacing. So I'm replacing the oil filter with a Raikou oil filter simply because this is the only one they stock at my local parts store. So inside the box is a brand new oil filter and also a new O-ring that goes on the oil filter housing. So the new O-ring, you just want to make sure that it is clean, and you also want to get some oil on there to lubricate it and also make sure it makes a good seal with the housing so that it doesn't leak. So you can just use some of the oil that's left in the bottom of the old housing. Get it on your fingers and just make sure that O-ring is nice and glossy the whole way around. And then the new oil filter just sits straight back in to the housing. Now there would be a torque specification for that filter housing. I'm not going to do it up with a torque wrench though, because it would be just a very small amount of torque needed. So long as the lid of this filter enclosure seats here, that O-ring is going to keep it sealed. So tight but not too tight. Remember, it's plastic, it's not relying on the torque to keep the seal, it's relying on that O-ring. So as long as it's seated, that should be good enough. So I'm going to tackle the vanoss solenoids here. So I'm just going to first disconnect the electrical connector, and this is the vanoss solenoid at the front of the engine block. So this is theoretically the easy one. So I've just undone that electrical connector and moved that out of the way. Now there is one bolt for this underneath the solenoid itself down there, and I believe it's going to be a 10mm bolt. Most of the bolts in this car are 10mm bolts. So I can get my 10mm socket underneath, and yep, that's 10mm. So I'll just undo that bolt. Alright, there it is. 10mm bolt. There it is. The vanoss solenoid. So here is the new solenoid and the original solenoid that has been in the car for over 160,000 kilometers. So you can actually see they're slightly different. This one has screens all the way around it, whereas this one only has a screen on the center section. I've got no idea what that means. This one I ordered on eBay. I think it's manufactured in Taiwan, whereas this would be the original equipment that came with the car out of the factory. But it was so cheap, I wasn't too fussed. I figure we'll see if it works. Some people actually clean these and can fix this same problem, so if this is no good, maybe I'll try cleaning this one. But I thought for $85 for two, we may as well replace both of them with brand new solenoids. And even though it is from Taiwan, it looks like the same part. It looks like it will fit. The electrical connector's the same, so let's see how we go. Now I'm just doing the same thing. I'm taking some old oil and putting it on the O-ring here, just to make sure that it's well lubricated before I put it back into the engine. Now I came out with the bolt fixture facing down, so that's the way I'll try to replace it with this new one. Now again, I'm sure there's a torque setting for the bolt that's underneath here, but it doesn't really matter. The seal comes from that O-ring that was already on the vanoss solenoid here. So just nice and snug. That bolt is just there to hold it in. It's not there to create a seal, so I've just done that up nice and hand tight. And I can plug the electrical connector, which looks nice and clean, back in. That was an affirmative click, and there we go, one down. except that's just the easy one, unfortunately. Alright, so far I've just replaced the solenoid for the vanoss system here at the front of the engine, and I've also replaced the oil filter, which is there also at the front of the engine. Now what I want to do is replace the solenoid that is around here. Sticking out the back of the engine, you can just see the back of it there, but as you can see it's buried underneath some ducting and the air filter, so I'm going to try to remove this first before I undo that, because hopefully it will make my life a lot easier. So I finally figured out how to get the airbox out of the car. I ended up taking the air filter out and the housing apart to figure out how to pull it out, because it felt like it was still attached at the bottom and I didn't want to break any fittings that might have been there if it was a screw or a bolt. But it is just actually held in by 2 press fittings. So if you're doing the same thing, you don't need to worry. There's only 2 little rubber grommets that push up through these holes in the airbox, and you can just pull it out, but I wasn't sure. I thought there might have been some bolts on the inside that I had to undo, so I thought better safe than sorry, and I took the air filter out. So I've now got easy access to the solenoid that's at the back of the engine after taking out the airbox, which contains the air filter, which was just here covering it. So I'm going to remove this rear vanoss solenoid now. Alright, so I finally got the solenoid out. It was a bit harder than I thought. Even without the airbox there, it's still a very limited space. I even tried wrapping a zip tie around there to give me more purchase, but I needed the power of some levering with a screwdriver. But I eventually got it out. Time to replace it with the new one and put everything back together. Alright, that's it. So the car is back together. Both vanoss solenoids have been replaced. The oil filter has been replaced. So now all we have to do is fill it back up with oil. But there's one thing to remember, and that's to put the drain plug back on. So when you're replacing the plug, the drain plug in the sump, you're meant to also replace this copper washer that's on the drain plug. Unfortunately, I can't find one that is the same size, so I'm just going to reuse this existing copper washer, and hopefully it doesn't leak. This is also somewhere where you want to use a torque wrench to torque up this plug to around 18 foot-pounds of torque. You don't want to do it up too tight, but you don't want it too loose either. So torque wrench is what you need. So I'm ready to fill the car with oil. The sump plug's back on. Of course, I don't have a funnel, so I just cut the bottom off of the oil engine flush can that I had earlier, and that should do the trick. Now, the Mini that I have, non-turbo, holds around 4.5 litres of oil, but there'll still be some of that old oil left in there. So I'll put around 4.5 litres in, and I'll just check it with the dipstick and see how we go. Always double check you don't leave tools in the engine bay. Alright, moment of truth. First start with fresh oil and 2 brand new vanoss solenoids. So far so good. It's hunting for idle a little bit, but that's not too bad. No check engine lights yet. So I'll turn it off check the oil level. If it needs a top up, I'll put a little bit more in, and then we'll take it for a drive and see if the check engine light comes back on. Drive and some town roads as well. Probably some pretty hard acceleration up to 100 kilometers an hour, and it all seems good. No check engine light. It's probably my imagination, but it feels more responsive. So thanks for watching. Hopefully it will help you if you've got the same issue with your car. And yeah, that's it.